Welcome to the MDs in Manufacturing podcast, where we hear directly from business leaders across Yorkshire on what it really takes to run a manufacturing business in today's climate. I'm Kerry Hope, Managing Director of Castle Employment Group, and today I'm joined by Chris Houston, Managing Director of Tadweld. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, nice to meet you, Kerry.
Thank you. Thanks so much for taking time to be with me today, because I'm imagining that you've got a very busy schedule, so I'm really grateful for you taking that time.
Absolutely happy to help.
Great. Chris, to kick off, do you want to tell our listeners more about what Tadweld are famous for?
So we're a specialist sort of engineering fabrication business, been trading just over 40 years, and we're based in Tadcaster in North Yorkshire, and we do a lot of work across the food and drink sector and other high-tech sectors, especially in things like structural steel work, sheet metal fabrication, and we work with some big brands, the likes of Coca-Cola, Heineken, Molson Coors. So day-to-day, well-recognized brands who expect really high quality fabrication and welding.
Fabulous, thank you. And I know that you've helped lead Tadweld through a huge period of growth recently and change, but where did it all start for you? How did your career path bring you into this role, and what's shaped your leadership style along the way?
Sure. So I guess everybody has their own journey. Mine is fairly untypical, I think, of an SME owner in Yorkshire. But I did a business degree straight out of school. I'm from York, and I defected to Lancaster actually to do a business degree, and then joined Rolls-Royce Aerospace in the kind of in the aerospace sector for 5 years. I did a graduate program through them, and then I was fortunate enough to join a smaller business, one of their suppliers in the aeronautical distribution space. I like to kind of refer to it almost as the B&Q of aerospace. Lots of big warehouses full of thousands and thousands of small parts, and was lucky enough to have multiple roles with them, from customer facing, supplier facing, strategy roles, and then actually moved to the US to run their US business.
Mm-hmm.
I was out there a total of 5 years through kind of Donald Trump round one and COVID and all of the ups and downs of the aerospace sector as it was, and then ultimately decided that I wanted to come back to the UK and move out of what was a private equity, large corporate environment, and come and do something more local, more regional, and ultimately build a life back in my home county, and that's really where Tadweld came in. So I was looking for investment opportunities in the region, looked at a number of businesses, and it was sort of a mutual family link that I managed to become aware of Tadweld. It's not a family owned business, albeit hopefully we'll come on to talk about some of the culture and values of the business, and it feels very much like that, but it's not. It's it's an investor-owned organisation, and I'm fortunate enough now to be one of those investors. And when I made my investment back in 2022, I joined the business as managing director, and have now been there around 3 years.
Brilliant, and I couldn't agree more. I often think successful SME leaders can make the transition from the corporates into SME, and along with that brings that structure that you see in a corporate, but you can apply it, can't you, really successfully into an SME environment. So I can empathise completely on that transition across. I know I came from a corporate and then moved into an SME, and people don't appreciate what you learn and how you can make that transition across. So thanks for sharing that. I know that you have recently in the press been really vocal about the severe skills shortages in welding especially, and for SMEs like yours, this is a big challenge. Is there anything else creating pressure right now for you, whether that's people like we've mentioned, or cost, tariffs, competition, or capacity? What's your biggest pressure point?
Yeah, I think with all businesses, it begins with people. And I think specifically one of the topics I've been particularly vocal about is apprenticeships and getting the younger generation interested in, yes, of course, welding, but also just sort of the STEM subjects as a wider bunch of or topics for careers. And there's been some recent policy changes that have made that sort of more costly and more expensive for employers to do, which I think is counterproductive to where we're heading. But outside of that, the landscape is difficult. You know, the UK economy, as we've seen, experience a lot of inflation, the same things that are affecting us in the home, like energy costs and those kind of things, interest rates, they all affect the business climate, particularly working with some of the large multinationals that we work with. It affects their appetite to invest in the UK, as they're looking at a global remit of investment opportunities, whether they're going to open a new factory in the UK or in a different European country or even in a different international country. So some of those things that affect us on a micro level, actually beyond our SME remit, affect the investment decisions more broadly, and some of the other things like Brexit and things come into those considerations. Fortunately, from a tariff perspective, we've not experienced too much of an impact there. That has predominantly been sort of European to US steel, and that hasn't, played out too much. But just again, that general uncertainty in the economy is making things people a little bit reticent to make those final investment decisions, and I'm sure you're seeing that across your client base as well.
Absolutely. The biggest pain point and pressure and conversations are just everything related to uncertainty and what's coming next from Rachel Reeves, what's coming next that might affect businesses that doesn't seem to be on our side, that's just making things really challenging. So yeah, that's exactly what I'm hearing from our client base. So thanks for sharing that, because what is brilliant to hear and see is that you are still moving forward and having really fabulous years like you have had last year, and you're clearly not standing still. Would you say, or would you be able to share what change, whether that's big or small, that you feel might have helped drive any efficiencies or value in your business that you think would be helpful to share?
Yeah. I'll try and condense it to three things. I think number one was getting really clear on what we want to do, who we want to be, where we want to target as an organization. And it's that classic defining your USP or your value proposition to your clients. And when I joined the business 3 years ago, we didn't really have an outbound sales team. It was very much word of mouth, repeat customer, referral led, which is a fantastic base to build from, because it means that clients are using you because you're really good at what you do. But we didn't have a deliberate go strategy, and we've developed that quite considerably over the last 3 years. We now have a sales director, 2 business development managers, and a marketing lead. So our external presence is so much stronger, and with that comes all of your digital things like improved advertising, improved website, etc. So I think being really clear on what our value proposition is and our go-to-market plan.
Just on that, what percentage would you say now is new business? Like last year on that successful 2024 that you had, what percentage would you put that at now?
Probably over 20% of the business is
Brilliant.
new business acquisition. So that's been absolutely sort of fundamental for our growth. And it's not always about new business acquisition in terms of new names on the logo slide, so to speak, but also it's about mining those existing client relationships. So for us, for example, we might be really strong at a couple of the Coca-Cola sites in the UK, but then we don't really have a presence or support a couple of their other sites. So it's how are we deliberate about going and mining that, and how are we deliberate, and ultimately it's a win-win scenario, right? If we're a really great fabricator that turns up every time, that delivers a great quality product at the right price, then those other sites want to know about us. So how do we package that up and make sure that our go-to-market plan and our value prop is really clear? So I think that was one of the fundamentals that when I came into the business we really worked hard on with the existing team to develop. I think number 2 is all about people, culture, values, behaviors, and I could probably fill a whole separate podcast just on that topic. But I think defining the values of the organization and how as a leadership team we wanted to develop and shape the culture, what type of employer we wanted to be. We have 7 strategic themes in the business, but the number one is we want to be a great employer. That, I guess, coming to some of the talent shortages and attracting apprentices and all those kind of things, it's paramount to our success as an organization, not just to say that we value our people and people are our greatest asset and things like that. We want our people to actually feel like they are our greatest asset, and really, really be an employer that people know cares about them and wants the best for them. Because although it's simple, if you've got happy employees, they do better work. It still is surprising how many organizations seem to miss the mark a little bit on
Mm.
that. So we were very deliberate about
Brilliant.
running an employee engagement survey, understanding the needs of our employment base, putting in deliberate action plans, and and really driving the needle on doing that. And then the third one, just back to your point about operations and efficiency, was
Mm.
reviewing our footprint, our legacy equipment, machinery, opportunities to invest in new technologies and automation. We made a couple of sizable investments in some laser welding equipment, which is a new bit of kit to the market, which for thin, consistent welding is particularly higher quality and quicker, and also it's a slightly different skill to the traditional welding skills, so you can potentially pick that up a little bit quicker.
Mm.
We made some pretty significant investments in just replacing legacy kit, and whenever you do that, although they do a similar activity like bending or cutting or whatever, which is kind of fundamental, they do it more consistently, quicker,
Mm-hmm.
smarter, more connected in terms of like IoT and things like that. So I think that's in the three-step approach is develop the sales pipeline, implement a great culture, and then build an operation that can actually deliver that kind of dream that you've sold to your clients.
Yeah, brilliant. Is that on that third point then? Is that where you worked with Made Smarter and worked with them on the funding for that laser machine?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. For those who don't know, Made Smarter are a nationally funded
Mm.
scheme for businesses that want to embrace digital industry 4.0, particularly focused on the manufacturing sector. And so through that sort
Mm.
of laser welding, digital connected Internet of Things type topic, we were able to get some grant funding towards that
Mm.
investment. As you know, as an SME, every little helps to support those big investments.
Absolutely. And I think that in itself, and I would love to do a podcast on culture, by the way, but I think that in itself is a challenge for leaders to constantly need to be knowing where they need their finger on the pulse to know where is the funding, where to get the funding. And I can appreciate that MedSmart have got a lot of work to do to make sure that everybody knows where they are and how to access that funding. So it's brilliant that you've been proactive and taken the initiative to find out where that is and how to use it. Thank you so much for sharing those three areas. They're certainly areas that leaders will be able to resonate with and reflect on, I'm sure. And you did talk a little bit about it, but I'd like an opportunity to talk further on. I was reading that you'd delivered over 2,500 hours of training in the past year, and you've gone on to hire your 50th team member. And you've also flagged, we were talking about earlier about the rising wage costs and how that impacts apprenticeships. And other than what you've already mentioned, is there anything else you would want to elaborate on that is around your attraction, how you're getting people in? Because obviously the culture and the values is how you're retaining them.
Mm.
But is there anything on what you're doing differently from an attraction point of view? Or anything that you want to share on tackling the longer term workforce pipeline challenge?
Yeah. Do you know what? I think it's amazing the conversations that I had down the pub. And what I mean by that is
Mm.
if you have an engaged and happy workforce, it's not just their immediate family when they go home on an evening that recognizes that. There is so much in the way that our employees are our employer brand into our customers,
Mm-hmm.
because for I'd say over 80% of the work we do, we actually visit our customer's site to install it. So they don't get to see me, they get to see Joe, who's a welder or
Mm.
whatever. So they represent us, and it's why we all wear brands and why we work really hard at that reputation. But they also represent us when they go down to the pub on a Friday evening and they talk to their mates about they really love the fact that they're working at Tadweld, or we've done some new things. So I think that has gone a long way to almost having a pipeline of people that want to come and work for Tadweld.
Brilliant.
When we put a welding or a labourer advert out, we normally get 5 to 10 applications within the first week. Of course, if we can get a referral, or if we know someone that knows somebody else, then gives us an insight, then that's all the better,
Mm.
really. And so we've been able to attract friends of friends or other people who've worked in the industry,
Mm-hmm.
and then be in sort of a semi-luxurious position of being able to
Mm.
choose between two or three candidates. On the flip side, I think back to the training point, is there is an expectation, I think, both at a younger level when people join the business, but also into a middle manager level, that people come with the skills, whether it's a 16-year-old that somehow we expect to be diligent, hardworking, always turn up on time, and have somehow colleges produce this wonderful person for you to employ. I think to me that just seems like a bit of a misnomer. It's inherent on the organization to shape and develop and coach and mentor and things like that. And so there's a couple of really famous quotes around what happens if I invest or I train somebody and then they become really good and they leave. And it's like, yeah, but what if you don't train them and they stay? And that's one of my favorite quotes, I think, is that
Brilliant.
that 2,500 hours, that investment that we're giving into people,
Mm.
people value. And as you've mentioned, it's potentially more of a retention thing rather than an attraction thing. But being able to then vocalize that then hopefully attracts other people that want to come to a workplace where they'll get opportunities and they know that they'll be, invested in, and hopefully we can get the best out of them. And again, that provides self-fulfillment and things like that because people feel like they're doing valuable work. So yeah, I'd say that's the biggest thing. There's no master advertising plan. There's job descriptions and things are all important. Absolutely they are, but we don't promise anything beyond the norm.
Out of interest, how do you manage that internally then? Is it that you've upskilled your line managers to be better at developing people and to be bringing them through and doing on job training? Or is it that you've invested in an external company? Or is it that you've got an internal person? Because I'm really interested. I mean, as you say, we can talk much longer about this subject, but that's huge investment, and investment in people is the best investment. And the cost of a new hire, you know yourself what that can be. So it's invaluable. But how do you actually practically make that happen?
Yeah. I think number one is from a recruitment and sort of talent identification process is to, again, it's kind of cliche, but recruit behaviors, not experience. I think unless you really, really do need some very specialist type of experience or skill set, but, very early doors, identified the talent within the organization or the management team in the organization were fantastic individuals, fantastic human beings, but potentially hadn't had the opportunity to go on management development programs and courses and things like that. So that was through the support of identifying the right external provider to provide them with leadership and management development. We've run supervisor essential programs. Some of those have been in-house that we've worked with an external provider to deliver something specific to Tadweld. Other times that's in more of an open program format where you're sending one person into an environment where there's 3 or 4 other companies and people get to share. So yeah, it really depends. And then one of the other really nice things that I think we're really strong in are the company values. So we have 3: teamwork, quality, innovation. We try and keep that really clean because I think you start to forget when businesses have 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and we make that very real on a monthly basis. So we recognize employees. We have an internal recognition program that allows anybody to recognize anybody else. We give out branded chocolate, £50 vouchers, etc., just to recognize those people that go above and beyond. And I would say that in itself gives a very strong indication of the people who you would potentially want to consider to be leaders in your future organization, because they are the ones that are actually living and practicing the values on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just really refreshing to hear. That's absolutely why you're standing out and why everyone in the local area or that's got a skill set that knows what you're hiring will be choosing you as an employer, because it's refreshing and it's stale out there, and other leaders really need to reflect on that, I think. So thank you for expanding on that. I mean, you've clearly been making bold moves to be able to achieve the success. Is there any tough call that you've had to make, and was there any learns that you could share from that other leaders might reflect on or be able to resonate with?
Tough calls. I think as leaders you make hundreds of decisions every day, and I think probably, I'd say most leaders think the hardest ones generally either revolve around giving feedback or ultimately ending employment. And as a growing business, I think we've probably hired over. When I started, we had a head count of 23, as you've just referenced. We're up to 50 now in a 3-year period. I think we probably got 3 or 4 hires wrong along that way, and they weren't necessarily bad individuals or anything like that. Sometimes you do just make a mistake, and there's a disconnect between what that employee thinks they're coming into and what you think they can bring. Other times it's cultural fit, other times it's individual fit, like
Hmm.
manager to employee fit. So I think they're always the hardest, is to recognize early enough and know when you can invest, and you need to make sure that you're giving people enough opportunity and giving them the feedback and things to be able to turn something around or to develop, but also to know when actually the best thing for both sides is to move on. That's very generic and non-specific, so I apologize for the example, but I think in general, they are always the toughest calls. I think I'm really digging into the depths here in terms of like trying to make difficult decisions. One of the ones that I think the team maybe struggled with was that Tadweld as an SME was and is a very community focused business. And so we do lots of work in terms of supporting local school clubs, school teams, trying to be a good corporate citizen.
Mm.
But at the same time, as an organization and as a profitable business, if somebody walks through the door and wants their step ladders repairing, or we've had quite a few funny examples. We've had a reindeer losing its horn and wanting the horn welding back on. We've had, say, ladder repairs, little badges that people want
Right.
welding up and things like that. And you want to help. As a business, you want to help.
Mm.
But there's also recognition that you don't just not make money, you lose money when you do really, really small local support projects. And so we instigated a £1,000 minimum order threshold. And
Hmm.
don't get me wrong, people can still walk in the door, beg for forgiveness, and but we still, of course, do small local community projects. But where possible, we try to say no to that type of work. We're
Mm.
now at an organisation size where we just can't really
Yeah.
support that. And that was a bit of a tricky one to sell to the team, or even at least have
Mm.
the conversation with the team. And it probably took several months and several attempts for me to eventually get them to recognise that, yeah, probably we can no longer do that because it's distracting us from delivering much bigger projects
Yeah.
for larger clients. So I'm sure there's many SMEs that struggle with that little kind of dilemma of wanting to do small bits of work, but that's probably not what's driving your business revenue.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are, like you said, the toughest decisions where you know that you're not going to get the initial buy-in, but in time they see the way, they see the light. Fantastic. Well, thanks for sharing that because I can imagine that was a tricky time. You recently said that it was a cliff edge moment for welding in the UK. And we talk about, like you've mentioned, from an apprenticeship point of view, that we need to get some more skills coming through. What would you like to see happen? Is there anything specific that you're an ambassador for? Is that from colleges? Is that from the government or industry? What do you think needs to happen to turn the tide in this skill shortage and specifically around welding in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, first off, it starts with recognizing we've got a problem, and I think
Mm.
that is becoming more evident. I think, the recent industrial strategy that was published specifically highlighted welding as a sort of a nationally strategic important skill that lacked a pipeline of talent or of people coming into the industry. So I think it's great that it's starting to get the recognition that it deserves. And I think it's unfortunate that most things end up in a money conversation, but the
Mm.
reality is a little bit. I remember when I was younger, there was incentives for people to become maths teachers, right? There was a national shortage for maths
Mm.
teachers, and therefore I can't remember exactly what the program was, but you could get your university fees funded or whatever that
Absolutely.
looked like. And I think, it doesn't have to be rocket science. I think fundamentally it does come down to if the government feels like that's a nationally important skill, that funding would go a long way to do that. I think all
Mm.
apprenticeships are currently funded in terms of the course element of it, but the challenge for employers has become incrementally difficult is purely the cost
Mm.
of or employment in its own right. Welding is at our welding level 3 courses are a 3.5 year program. Minimum wage for an apprentice is now £10 an
Mm.
hour. And the reality is, in those 3.5 years, we have someone that is unskilled. Obviously, towards the end of that time, they're becoming more skilled and we can start to charge for time and things like that. But the upfront cost of
Mm.
training a 16-year-old over that lifetime is probably
Mm.
in excess of £70,000 without the costs that we're foregoing in or the hours lost of the trainer training that apprentice, etc. That's just the cost of
Mm.
employing that person. And so yeah, trying to do that en masse is really, really difficult. So I think number one is funding. I think number
Mm.
two, and I think this is where we have made strides as as a country, as a society, is the recognition that trades and apprenticeships and things like that are a genuine alternate to further education from an academic perspective. And that's why, in a way, it feels so frustrating that probably over the last 10 years, we've worked really hard at building STEM and manufacturing and things like that as a place where people want to be. And yet now we have the demand from students coming out. I think, we normally have applications for our apprentice program, sometimes more, but we can't afford to take them on. So there are students there are young adults who want to come and learn more about welding and want to try and develop a career in engineering, but organizations simply can't afford to take them into the workforce, which is really difficult, and is only more difficult, I think, the smaller the business is as well. So yeah, for my two penneth worth, that's the challenge. And I guess the final bit of that around education is that colleges will go where the demand is fundamentally, and also where the funding is. But with the lower amount of apprenticeships, say, I think this latest cohort at York, which is the college that we use for our welders apprenticeships, for the level 3 course, maybe only 7 or 8 people. And of course, they have to fund a tutor, they have to fund the syllabus to support that. So it's a little bit of a self-fulfilling cycle that the lower the number of places are available in industry, the lower the number of apprenticeships that need support from a college, and therefore the lower the number of courses, or the lower the number of the colleges that have welding apprenticeships on offer. So I would like nothing more than a big UK rallying behind welding as an industry.
I couldn't agree anymore. And actually, one of the biggest frustrations is the amount of app levy money that employers have to pay that they don't spend, that just goes back to the government, whereas actually that could be recycled into a contribution toward those that aren't having to pay the app levy to transfer it across. And you can do that, but it still wouldn't be enough funding to pay the salary. It's still only for the course, isn't it? So, but they could recycle that money if they've already allocated it to that, then it could go towards the funding. So yeah, I couldn't agree more with that, and I'd be behind the rally that's going forward for it. But thank you for sharing all of that, and thank you for joining me on today's episode of MDs in Manufacturing, because it's been brilliant to hear your perspective, not just on what it takes to grow and obviously lead a business like Tadweld, but also to hear about how you've gone about attracting people into the business, your employee value proposition, how to become an employer of choice, which you've talked about. And it's, as I mentioned earlier, it was so refreshing to hear what you're doing, because it's quite different to what we hear the majority talking about. And I think, like you say, it'd be great to get another podcast on how to make those changes culturally to really help with retention and then ultimately attraction. It shows that even in a tough climate, there is an opportunity for growth, like what you've shared with me today. So thank you for joining me.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And for everyone else tuning in, I hope today's conversation has given you a real practical insight. And I definitely think there are ideas in there for you to take away and reflect on, and reassurance that there are others facing the same challenges, but there are solutions out there as well. And hopefully this podcast will help the listeners find ways to keep moving forward. If you've enjoyed the episode, please give it a like, share it with your network, and subscribe to the MDs in Manufacturing podcast, so that you don't miss any future conversations with these inspirational leaders. Chris, thanks again for your time, and thank you to everyone for listening. We'll be back soon with some more stories from Yorkshire's manufacturing leaders.